Late one night in the spring of 1997, a woman from the city of Monroe, North Carolina, was driving down a quiet country road when she found herself in the middle of a frightening situation. She was on her way home when suddenly she noticed she was being aggressively followed by another vehicle. While this was understandably pretty scary, luckily she was able to get away. She would actually report what had happened to police, and at first it seemed like a one-off incident. However, all of that would change just 2 weeks later, when the woman's vehicle was found abandoned under extremely unsettling circumstances on this same stretch of road. That previous incident would ultimately be linked to what had happened. As for how it was connected, though, well, that was a truth that no one was prepared for. The evening of March 28th, 1997, started out as a pretty standard one for husband and wife Bridger and Kim Medlin. Though it was the Friday of Easter weekend, the couple had no intentions of taking it easy. Instead, they were both busy working. Bridger was a DJ with a company called East Coast Entertainment. That evening, he had a gig at a high school prom. Kim had a couple of different jobs, but that night would be picking up a shift as a cocktail server at a gentleman's club in Charlotte, North Carolina, a business that was literally called the Men's Club. Neither of them expected to be home until the early hours of the following morning. Needless to say, this kind of schedule isn't for everyone, but working these late hours is actually what had brought Kim and Bridger together in the first place. They met in 1991 while they were both working at a hotel bar in Charlotte. Initially, Kim admired Bridger's talent as a DJ, and he was drawn to her vibrant and outgoing personality. They didn't get together right away. Instead, the long nights gave them an opportunity to talk and get to know each other. It was one of those situations where, for a long time, if you'd ask either one of them, they'd insist that they were just really good friends, even though they were clearly in love with each other. When the pair finally did come clean about their relationship, things moved quickly. Within 8 months of dating, Bridger had proposed and they were engaged. The couple was married in September of 1994. After the wedding, Kim and Bridger both kept similar jobs to the ones that they'd been doing, but now it was more of a means to an end. They agreed that they would work as hard as possible with the goal of fulfilling one of Kim's lifelong dreams. From the time that she was a girl, Kim had loved animals, especially horses. Growing up, she was always riding and taking care of them, and she wanted to have a horse farm of her own. I say this was Kim's dream, but Bridger fully supported her and was into the idea as well. He may have had a career as a DJ, but he came from a family that had done farming for generations on both his mother and father's side, so he had more than a little experience. After some time of really working and scrimping and saving, Kim and Bridger had been able to start making their plans a reality. They purchased some land in the city of Monroe, about 30 miles southeast of Charlotte. This was great because Bridger was born and raised here, so for him, it already felt like home. There, they had started working on their dream house, and they had constructed a barn where they kept a few horses and some other smaller animals. The goal was eventually to turn the horse farm into its own business, but Kim and Bridger still had a long way to go before everything was fully finished. Until then, they had continued the grind of working these late nights, doing whatever it took to make ends meet. Because they were so often apart so late into the evening, Kim and Bridger did their best to check in with one another and stay in contact, particularly when they were on their way home. The night of March 28th / the morning of March 29th was no different. Bridger spoke to Kim after leaving his gig, then again after he got home shortly before 2:30 a.m. By this point, she had also clocked out for the day and said that she was on her way back too. She guessed that she'd be there in about 10 to 15 minutes. Unfortunately, that would not be the case though. You see, almost immediately after this final phone call, Kim Medlin would abruptly vanish. At around 3:45 a.m. on March 29th, so about an hour after Kim was supposed to have returned home, the Monroe Police Department began receiving calls from concerned motorists. A couple people said that they had been driving down Old Charlotte Highway, a 2-lane country road that led into the city, when they spotted a suspicious-looking vehicle. It was a red Jeep Wrangler that appeared to have been abandoned. When officers went out to investigate, they found the Jeep just as described. It was parked on the grassy shoulder of the roadway a few miles outside the main part of the city, near the intersection of Old Charlotte Highway and North Rocky River Road. Immediately, the situation was pretty eerie. The Jeep's headlights were on, the driver's side window was rolled down, and the engine was running. But there was no sign of anyone around. It was as if the driver had simply evaporated. Police ran the vehicle's plates and discovered that it belonged to 26-year-old Kim Medlin. As they took a closer look at her Jeep, they noticed more strange details. Kim's phone and her purse were still inside. Her purse was open on the passenger seat, but all of her cash, credit cards, and other valuables appeared to be there. In fact, the only thing officers couldn't find was her driver's license. The officers had barely had a chance to start thinking any of this over when suddenly they heard a noise coming from the Jeep. It was Kim's phone ringing. On the other end was Bridger. As soon as police told him what they had found, he said that he was on his way. When Bridger arrived, he looked and sounded completely frantic. He said he had no idea what was going on, and that he had been on the phone with Kim only a short time earlier. He explained that he had talked to her twice that morning, and that when they last spoke just after 2:30, she was supposed to be relatively close to home. Whatever had happened here, it must have taken place almost right after they got off that second call. At this point, authorities were convinced that there was something seriously wrong. Detectives were brought in to begin a proper investigation, and as soon as the sun came up, a search effort was launched. Word spread fast in the small city about the disappearance, and a large group of volunteers quickly assembled to assist law enforcement and Kim's worried family. From the beginning, everyone tried their best to remain optimistic. They hoped that there would be some kind of reasonable explanation for all of this, and that Kim would be safely returned home before too long. Sadly, this is not what happened. Shortly after 6:30 p.m. on March 30th, so about 40 hours after Kim went missing, 2 volunteers made a heartbreaking discovery while participating in the search effort. The pair had gone down a dead-end road in an industrial zone about 2 miles away from where Kim's Jeep had been found. When they got to the end of that road, they found a pile of debris in the middle of a grassy and partially wooded area. Underneath a wooden pallet, some branches, and some other random pieces of garbage, they found Kim's body. Understandably, this fact alone came as a gut-wrenching blow to Kim's loved ones. But things were about to get worse. It was clear from how Kim was discovered that this was no accident. An autopsy would soon reveal that Kim had been the victim of a savage attack. She had suffered a number of blunt force injuries to her head and neck, ones that had left her with fractures to the base of her skull and cervical spine. This spine fracture had been part of what had killed her, along with strangulation that had broken the hyoid bone in her neck. These were far from the only injuries that Kim had sustained, though. She had scrapes and cuts over a large portion of the left side of her head, as well as on her knees, torso, neck, and back. To top it all off, whoever had done this had also stomped on her back. One thing that was immediately clear was that this was not a robbery. Just like with Kim's Jeep, all of the valuables in her possession were still with her body. This included her wedding band, her engagement ring, and a gold necklace that she was wearing. There was no evidence that Kim had been sexually assaulted, though authorities could not rule this out as a potential motive. Based on the evidence, it looked like Kim was attacked from behind, likely while she was running away. It was possible that the perpetrator had intended to assault her in this way, but that they had killed her instead when she tried to fight back. One unusual thing that investigators noticed was that Kim's wrists showed signs of having been bound. This stood out because there were no such bindings found at either of the crime scenes, meaning that the killer had likely removed them at some point. As for why, though, that remained a mystery. The biggest question of all, though, for detectives surrounded the brutality of the situation. In short, who could have hated Kim Medlin so much that they would kill her in such a rage-filled way? Authorities weren't sure, but they were about to learn something that they thought might point them in the right direction. Following the tragic discovery of Kim's murder, detectives with the Monroe Police Department began looking for any missing evidence that might explain what had happened to her. Very quickly, they started to wonder if the clues they needed might be found in her personal life, particularly when they got a new piece of information. That information came from one of their own officers, and it had to do with Kim's husband, Bridger. The officer, who knew Bridger and had been on patrol on the morning of March 29th, stated that they were pretty sure they had seen his black pickup truck passing through the main part of the city just after 2:30 a.m. According to the officer, the truck was heading in the direction of where Kim's Jeep was found. This was interesting, not only because it was right around the time and place that Kim had disappeared, but because Bridger had told police when he initially talked to them that he was already home by this point. Now, it's safe to say that Bridger would have been a person of interest in the killing no matter what, due to the unfortunate reality that people are just more likely to be murdered by those close to them. But this was an inconsistency that couldn't be ignored. As a result, he was brought in for questioning, where he was asked about the events leading up to Kim's disappearance in greater detail. Bridger explained that on the evening of March 28th, he was DJing for a high school prom across the state line in Manning, South Carolina. The event was about a 2-hour drive away from Monroe, which he said was pretty standard for him. Sometimes he would have to travel hundreds of miles and then would drive all night to get back. He said he left that morning when things wrapped up a little after midnight. Just before arriving at home, Bridger said he got a call from Kim. He estimated this was around 2:15 or 2:20, and that she told him she had left work as well. She asked if he would check on one of their horses who had recently undergone surgery. Bridger said that he did this as soon as he got in, and that he had called Kim back a few minutes later. This was when she had told him she would be there in about 10 to 15 minutes. Bridger stated that he had tried to wait up for Kim, but that he had ended up dozing off. When he woke up, it was 4 a.m., and he started to worry because he realized Kim wasn't home. That's when he had called her phone, only to be greeted by police on the other end. That, he claimed, was the only point at which he had driven back into town. During the interview, Bridger was visibly angry and upset. He denied any wrongdoing and said that police were wasting their time. He was innocent, and the real killer was still out there. In fact, he said he had a pretty good idea of who might be responsible. Bridger explained that on the morning of March 15th, so exactly 2 weeks before Kim was murdered, she was on her way home from work like usual when she had a very unsettling experience. While driving down almost the exact same section of Old Charlotte Highway where her vehicle would later be found, she had come up on a car that was driving slower than her. Inside were 2 men who she didn't know. Because Kim's Jeep was higher up off the road than this car, her headlights had kind of shone into the back of it. She didn't do this on purpose, but it made the men extremely angry. The driver pulled into the other lane, and at first, Kim just thought he was letting her pass. However, as soon as the men got behind her, they started tailgating her and driving very aggressively. It quickly became clear that they intended on following her. Understandably, Kim was frightened, but she knew she needed to keep going. To her relief, when she got a little closer to the main part of the city, she saw a couple of Monroe police officers who were sitting in their patrol cars in a plaza parking lot. Immediately, she turned into the lot and explained everything that had happened. The car that was following her had continued driving, but the officers had told Kim that everything was okay and that they would take care of it. After hearing all of this, detectives ended their interview with Bridger. They still weren't necessarily sure that he was telling them the truth, but they needed to look further into what he had told them, as well as see if they could confirm his alibi. It turned out that authorities weren't the only ones who were suspicious of Bridger. Plenty of people in the community were convinced that he had killed Kim, and over the next few days and weeks, rumors would spread like crazy. Discussion of the murder became nearly impossible to avoid in the area. People talked about the case at diners, called into local radio shows and news stations, and reported their own theories about what had happened to police. They didn't stop there, though. A couple of people called Bridger directly to accuse him of murder, or else phoned his family members to harass them. One particularly vicious rumor spread so widely and was believed by so many people that authorities were forced to put out statements in local newspapers multiple times saying that it wasn't true. That rumor was that Bridger had confessed to Kim's murder at her funeral. This is all the more upsetting when you know that while all of this was happening, in the background, investigators were learning that everything Bridger had told them was checking out. Phone records from him and Kim placed them both in the locations he had said they were when they spoke, and surveillance footage from a bank machine in the middle of the city showed Bridger's truck going towards the scene of Kim's abandoned Jeep only after he had spoken with police that morning. There was no footage of him heading there around 2:30 a.m., as that officer had previously claimed. When detectives looked into what Bridger had told them about the road rage situation Kim had been involved in on March 15th, they discovered that there was a police report that had been written about the incident. The report matched everything Bridger had said, but also included other helpful details. For instance, police had actually managed to pull over the men in the car that had been tailgating Kim. They had been let go at the time, but officers had taken down their names. For further context on the whole situation, investigators talked to the person that Kim had primarily spoken with that morning, Monroe police officer Roger Griffin. He said that, yeah, he definitely remembered Kim. She had been really shaken up about what had happened, and he had done his best to comfort her. Roger said that what had really made Kim uneasy was the fact that she worked late nights a lot, so she took this route all the time. As a result, she was worried that it would be easy for these guys to find her again if they wanted to. Roger explained that to try and give Kim a little peace of mind, he had promised her that he and the other officers on the night shift would try to look out for her. He said that it was a good group of guys and that his son was also an officer and that they'd take care of her. Just to make sure, he even put out an alert over the radio so that they would know to specifically keep an eye out for anyone who might be following her. He said he felt terrible because obviously they had failed to do that. After learning all of this, investigators were very interested in the two men from the road rage incident and immediately began trying to track them down. They also explored another theory. Maybe Kim's murder had something to do with the club where she worked, perhaps a regular who had developed an obsession with her. The men's club had a reputation for having some seedy characters who hung out there, but when investigators spoke to Kim's co-workers, they said that nothing out of the ordinary had happened there in the lead up to the killing. On top of this, they said that Kim was really good with dealing with the customers. She knew how to handle herself in potentially bad situations, and she would have said something if someone was being weird or creepy with her. Within a short amount of time, detectives were able to find the two men from the road rage incident and bring them in for questioning as well. The men both denied having anything to do with the crime, and even went as far as to claim that they were the ones who had been harassed by Kim. This was pretty ridiculous, but at the same time, both of them had solid alibis. While this appeared to be another dead end, investigators couldn't shake the feeling that they were still somehow on the right track. The fact that the road rage incident had happened at almost the exact same time and in the exact same place where Kim's Jeep was found just didn't feel like a coincidence. It turned out the detectives were right about this. It was just that they were looking in the wrong place. Kim Medlin's killer was much closer than they realized. When it was first discovered that Kim had been murdered, a couple of other law enforcement entities had been brought in to assist with the case. This included the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, who, among other things, had taken on the role of processing different bits of evidence. One of the people assigned to the case was Ricky Navarro, a special agent with expertise in latent evidence. Agent Navarro was given a number of items that had been found at both crime scenes, including Kim's clothing. While processing her sweater, he found something that would completely change the case. As I previously mentioned, some of the most disturbing wounds that Kim had sustained during the fatal assault were those stomping injuries to her back. Well, as it happened, those injuries were forceful enough that they had left behind faint impressions on her sweatshirt, the marks from which Navarro was able to lift and analyze. Analysis revealed that the impressions had been made by a heeled boot, one with a distinctive chevron pattern on the sole. They were so distinctive, in fact, that Navarro was able to determine the shoe's manufacturer and model. They had been made by a company called Thorogood. Representatives from the company were able to give Navarro even more important information. The major purchaser of this specific kind of boot, they said, it was primarily law enforcement, and these boots just so happened to be part of the standard issue uniform for the Monroe Police Department. Now, as shocking as this was, this revelation actually made a lot of sense once detectives started to think about the case as a whole. You know, Kim's Jeep didn't look like it had been run off the road when they found it. In reality, it was much closer to a traffic stop. If you recall, her lights and engine were on, the driver's side window was down, and the only thing missing was her driver's license. On top of this, she had just had that terrifying road rage experience a couple weeks earlier. The idea of her pulling over for anyone at night seemed very unlikely, unless she thought that person was some kind of authority figure. I should say that investigators weren't caught completely off guard here. They had looked into a similar version of this theory previously, specifically that the killer might have been someone impersonating a police officer, otherwise known as a blue light bandit. There were actually 2 suspects in the area who had been caught committing crimes this way, and Monroe detectives had looked into both of them. However, they were ruled out. What they hadn't considered was that the killer might be a real police officer, let alone one of their own. Thanks to Special Agent Navarro's analysis, one other vital clue was uncovered about the boot that had left the impressions on Kim's sweater: its size. The boot was a men's 8.5. While there were roughly 150 officers in the Monroe Police Department, only 3 wore this size of boot. Of them, only 1 didn't have a solid alibi. His name was Josh Griffin. Josh was the son of Roger Griffin, that officer who Kim had first reported the road rage incident to 2 weeks before her murder. Josh was a rookie officer who had been with the Monroe Police Department for a little over a year. However, in just this short amount of time, he had developed a reputation for some pretty troubling behavior. Specifically, he was known for pulling young women over without legitimate reasons. When he did, he would try and chat them up. As investigators zeroed in on Josh and started grilling the other officers around him, several admitted that they had heard him talk about Kim a number of times over their police radios in the lead up to the murder. Josh didn't know Kim, but he had heard that report about her being followed after his father had spoken to her. Afterwards, he had become obsessed with the pretty blonde in the Jeep and said that he was determined to meet her. Because of the police report, Josh not only knew where the road rage incident had taken place, he knew Kim's work schedule and the route that she traveled to get home. So he started waiting for her so that he could pull her over and talk to her under the guise of it being a traffic stop. Josh denied any involvement in the crime when he was questioned by detectives. However, when they looked into his alibi, it completely fell apart. Not only did he lie about the time that he had gotten home on the morning of March 29th, he lied about being on patrol. He claimed that he had told his supervisor that he was doing some overtime, but this wasn't true. He never told anyone this, and instead had been patrolling in his squad car, pretending to be working when he was actually off duty. On the night of March 28th, Josh was working security at a local Walmart in Monroe, but he finished up his official work around 10:30 p.m. From there, he had driven to the parking lot of a diner called Ron's Restaurant, which was right at the intersection of Old Charlotte Highway and North Rocky River Road. In other words, exactly where Kim's Jeep was discovered. Josh's own phone and a couple of witnesses placed him at that location around the time that she had disappeared, and another witness would later claim they had seen Kim's Jeep being pulled over by a police vehicle. This witness stated that they were confused because they didn't think Kim had done anything wrong, but they didn't stop or say anything because they were driving with a suspended license and didn't want to get in trouble. When authorities searched Josh's home and vehicles, there were no smoking guns, so to speak, but what they didn't find was almost as interesting as what they did. Josh, who was known for having one of the dirtiest police cruisers in the whole fleet, had meticulously cleaned his vehicle. When asked for his boots, he claimed that he had thrown them away because they were damaged. On May 30th, a month to the day that Kim Medlin's body was discovered, Josh Griffin was arrested and charged with first-degree kidnapping and first-degree murder. While no one can say for sure what happened the night of Kim's murder, here's what the prosecution argued when the case went to court the following year. On the night of March 28th, Josh Griffin finished up work and then drove to the parking lot of Ron's restaurant. He then waited there until Kim drove by around 2:30 a.m. after she got off the phone with Bridger. After pulling Kim over, Josh asked for her license and then told her to come and wait with him in his vehicle. At some point, he likely made advances towards her, and Kim realized that none of this had anything to do with any legitimate traffic violation. When she demanded to be let go, Josh knew that he was in trouble, and he panicked. He handcuffed Kim, threw her in the back of his patrol car, and started driving. Prosecutors theorized that at some point Kim had escaped, and realizing what kind of danger she was in, had tried to run for her life. But Josh had caught her and had brutally beaten and strangled her to death. They argued that the blunt force injuries and fractures to her skull and neck could have been inflicted by Josh's police flashlight. Once Kim was dead, Josh had tried to cover her body, then had removed the handcuffs. This is what had left the marks on her wrists. While the case was circumstantial, it was enough to convince a jury. In late February of 1998, Josh was convicted of both murder and kidnapping and was sentenced to life in prison. I should point out that while Josh pleaded his innocence, 3 years following his conviction, he offered a strange sort of half-confession. After asking to sit down with agents with the SBI, he reportedly admitted to killing Kim, though attempted to minimize his role. He claimed that he owed a debt to drug dealers for steroids and had agreed to pay them by kidnapping Kim. He claimed he murdered her while the dealers held them both at gunpoint. Much like Josh's previous claims, according to the SBI agents he spoke with, this story didn't add up either. He was never able to give even a basic description of the so-called drug dealers, and another police officer he attempted to implicate in the murder did have a solid alibi. However, some additional information was gathered. During the interview, Josh apparently admitted he had thrown out his police boots in a dumpster behind a store after the killing and had cut up and flushed Kim's driver's license down the toilet. At the time of this recording, Josh Griffin remains incarcerated at the Pamlico Correctional Institution in Bayboro, North Carolina. This case is horrifying for a lot of reasons, but I think the vast majority of us can agree that the most awful part was that this was done by a police officer. This is a person who was entrusted with keeping the community safe, and instead, he was out there driving around and abusing his power to prey on women. What's even more gut-wrenching about this case in particular is when you consider that in some ways, it was Kim's trust in the police that led to her death. She went to them because she was scared about the road rage incident and shared information with them that she thought would make her safer, only to have that information exploited by someone on the inside. Now, I'm not saying that people should be broadly suspicious of law enforcement or anything, and honestly, I'm not qualified to delve into the contemporary politics of policing and its relations with the public. But what I think we can probably all understand here is how something like this does enormous damage to the public trust. This was definitely true for Kim's family, who in interviews we came across expressed the anger, grief, and sense of betrayal they felt, particularly with the Monroe Police Department. It was bad enough that one of their own officers were responsible for the murder, but even before this, the family claimed that they had largely been kept in the dark. In a letter written by Kim's mother, Sharon, published in a local newspaper, she stated that police had shared almost no information with the family during the investigation. She said that they learned almost everything secondhand from news reports, and often after details had already been given to the public. One of the most upsetting passages of the letter has to do with the discovery of Kim's body, and reads in part, quote, "My husband and I were in Monroe participating in the search for Kim until 9 p.m. on the evening Kim was found. We left Monroe that evening and went home preparing for the next day's search. We were full of optimism and hope. The 11 p.m. news reported that a body had been found and that it was believed to be Kim. After midnight, I received my first and only call from officials confirming that information. The call came 6.5 hours after her body was found. In addition, Kim's body had been found 3 hours before my husband and I left Monroe." These sentiments have been echoed by Bridger, who not only dealt with this same lack of information, but also with being vilified by the community at large. One of the most heartbreaking statements of the whole case that we found came from him when he pointed out that in his mind, Kim was essentially killed for obeying the law. First, for reporting an incident, and then for stopping for Josh Griffin when he pulled her over. One loose end that I also wanted to touch on briefly was the statement from the officer that claimed to have seen Bridger's truck. Frustratingly, there was no other information we could find about this, so it's not clear if this was simply a mistake or someone actively trying to implicate him in the crime. What we do know is that several officers were disciplined in the wake of Josh Griffin's arrest because they had known about his obsession with trying to meet Kim and hadn't said anything. All in all, there's a lot to think about here, and none of it is good. I don't really have much more to say, but I'm interested to hear what all of you think about this one in the comments section below. The one thing that I will leave you with is that in an interview we watched with Bridger, he said that he has been able to move on since all of this happened. He said it was incredibly difficult and that he will always remember the special time that he had with Kim, but that he has since been able to go on and live a good life. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.